it with men? It's like the smaller something is, the more they get worked up. Literally, all I have to do is walk past a lingerie shop and Mungo, my boyfriend, practically drags me inside. He'll pay anything just to get me in a pair of knickers the size of a post-it. It's almost as if the smaller something is, the more money men are prepared to throw at it. I mean, take the atom. It's so small, it's invisible, and yet they've spent £6 billion on building that collider just so they can smash it up. Men. If you ask me, it's all about temptation. Men just can't resist a challenge. They're so predictable. That's really how it was with atoms. I mean, the idea that everything was made up of tiny, indivisible particles started way back in ancient Greece. But back then, nobody really much cared if it was true or not. I mean, let's face it. If they can't see it, drink it, or get their hands on it, men just aren't really interested. Which is why atoms were pretty much forgotten about for 2,000 years. And they probably would have stayed that way had it not been for a typical bit of male wishful thinking. See? What's the one thing everyone wants? No, the other thing. Money, of course. But if you want to get rich a few hundred years ago, you might as well forget it, unless you were a king or a lord. I mean, back then, hedge funds were just a load of loose change buried in the middle of a field, and clever city boys like Mungo stood no chance. Then, someone started a rumour that it was possible to turn all sorts of rubbish into gold. Yeah, you'd think if they were that clever they'd have seen right through this. But then, you can never underestimate the power of greed. Just look at all those bankers. And it was the same back then. You know, lots of guys who should have known better became obsessed with making gold. They called it alchemy, which I suppose made them feel okay about wasting hundreds of years chasing some magic formula. I mean, seriously embarrassing. You can hardly blame them for keeping it quiet. Of course, it wasn't all bad. They did produce some useful things like perfume and cosmetics, but it was the techniques they developed, of breaking down all sorts of horrid things into stuff that couldn't be broken down any further, that grabbed the headlines. You see, what they'd actually done was isolate the first elements, which just goes to prove that, well, greed is good after all. Naturally, all but the real losers decided it was time for a rebrand, so they started calling themselves scientists, and that's when the atom made its comeback. You see, if an element was something so basic that it couldn't be broken down any further, yeah? Then it looked like each element must be made of its own unique atom. That's the thing about temptation. You never know where it might lead. I mean, all the alchemists wanted was unlimited wealth. What they got instead was an entire universe full of invisible atoms. And as if that wasn't horrendous enough, no sooner had they got their head around the idea that the atom was the smallest piece of stuff than they discovered something even smaller, the electron. Now, of course, if there's something smaller than an atom, then what else is there? It was all very frustrating, and the solution they came up with was just the same as when Mungo very kindly offered to fix my toaster for me. He decided that if he couldn't take it apart, he'd smash it instead. And that's exactly what they did. They smashed atoms together. It was like driving Daddy's Bentley head-on into a parked car, just so you could see what cars are made of. Not exactly subtle, but then that's men for you. Then, things got really weird. See, rather than crashing into each other, most of the time nothing happened at all. It was as if the parked car wasn't there. There was only an occasional collision, but when that happened, it was huge, as if the car just bounced straight back at them. So, they were forced to conclude that everything in the universe, everything that we think is solid and real, is mostly just empty space. And the atom wasn't a tiny solid thing at all, but an even smaller thing surrounded by a massive cloud of electrons. And if you took away all the empty space inside our bodies and just counted the solid bit in the middle of the atoms, then the whole of the population of the world, 6 billion people, would take up less space than this. Now if you think, well, at least they found the real atom, you know, the hard bit in the middle that you can't cut up. Dream on.
Because as they got better and better at smashing things up, the more and more bits that kept falling off. And first there were protons and neutrons, then they got smashed and we got quarks with all sorts of silly names like charm and strange. And then suddenly you had the makings of an entire scrapyard filled with new particles. Gravitons, photons, leptons, mesons, bosons, and the list keeps growing. I mean, what a mess. And are we really any nearer to finding out how all this works? Well, one thing you learn about life with a name like Pandora is once you open the box, there's no turning back.